Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much all for coming. It's great to see so many people here who've come on a wet Friday evening to come and talk about Palestine and what we can do in support of the Palestinian struggle. It's really great. I should also thank the Committee for a Just Peace in the Middle East for the really kind invitation to come and be with you this evening. My name's Michael Deas. I'm a British Palestine solidarity activist living in London, and I'm employed currently by a Palestinian organisation called the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee, which is a coalition organisation in Palestine of trade unions, of NGOs, of political parties that works to lead and works to support the movement for boycott, divestment and sanctions. I really wanted to do three things in a short sort of 30-40 minute presentation. I wanted to talk about why Israel is increasingly being described as a state that's practicing the crime of apartheid. I wanted to introduce a little bit the political framework of the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, and to talk also about the successes of the campaign so far and the impact that the campaign is starting to have. So I'll start then really by introducing the concept of Israeli apartheid, and maybe we move on one slide. Well, I'll make a start, and when the PowerPoint catches up, then all the better, but not to worry for now. So yeah, to start with an explanation of Israel and the analysis of Israel as a state practicing apartheid. So Israel was founded in, so I'm just going to move this because it's in my way. So as we know, Israel was founded in 1948, and Palestinians refer to this as al-Nakba, the catastrophe. We saw 600,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes, and hundreds of villages were destroyed in a premeditated plan to ethnically cleanse, to remove as many Palestinians from the land as possible. And since its foundation, since 1948, Israel has had one main motivation: to control as much of the land of historic Palestine as possible and to drive as many Palestinians from that land as possible. Israel really aims to separate the Palestinian people from the land of Palestine. And you can see in this map how over time the amount of land that is under Palestinian control has diminished to just a small fraction of what it was in 1947. And Israel has employed a whole host of inhumane policies to try and achieve this aim. And a growing number of people are looking at Israel's system, looking at Israel's policies together, and describing this as a system of apartheid. As most of us know, of course, apartheid is the Afrikaans word for separation. And by using the word apartheid, we're bringing images of how horrific South African apartheid was. And there are certainly many similarities between South Africa under apartheid and the situation in Palestine today. But by using the analysis, the term apartheid, we're also remembering how apartheid was eventually overcome by the struggle of the South African people, and also with assistance from international solidarity in the form of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. At its core, apartheid in South Africa was about the forced physical separation of two peoples and giving people different rights based on their ethnicity. In Palestine and Israel today, there are about 11 million people, 5.5 Jewish Israelis, and about 5.3 million other people, mainly Palestinians. All 11 million people are living under one state administration, one state government, the Israeli government. And Israel gives different rights to different people depending on their identity and depending on where they live, very much as was the situation in South Africa under apartheid. But we don't just use the term apartheid because of the similarities between what happened in South Africa and what's happening in Palestine today. Like genocide, like slavery, apartheid is a crime under international law that any country can be guilty of committing. The Rome Statute of the International Court defines apartheid, and you have the French here, as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of oppression by one racial group over another. So it's clear that many of Israel's actions against the Palestinians are inhumane, from the checkpoints to the wall to the discrimination faced by Palestinian citizens of Israel and so on. But what stands Israel out as arguably the only apartheid state in the world today is that these inhumane policies are put in place for the sole purpose of oppression by one group of people over another. And these policies aren't temporary or accidental. You know, we often hear European governments, well, we wish Israel would change this policy, or we wish Israel would change that policy. But actually, the apartheid system is written in, it's institutionalized, it's written into the laws and the regulations that govern how the Israeli state works and govern how the Israeli military operates. And there are all sorts of examples of apartheid policies in Palestine. Perhaps the clearest set of examples is when we look at access to land and access to housing. Within historical Palestine, within Palestine and Israel, who has access to what pieces of land and who has access to housing? So I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about a few examples, starting with the situation today in the West Bank. The purpose of Israel's policies in the West Bank is to concentrate the Palestinian population to smaller and smaller Bantustans, and to facilitate the expansion of illegal settlements and the colonization of Palestinian land. To date, 43% of the land of the occupied Palestinian West Bank is completely off limits to Palestinians and is allocated for use by illegal Israeli settlements. Settlements are Israeli-only towns that are built in contravention of international law on occupied land. So very often it's land that Palestinians have been driven from to make way for towns that only Israelis are able to live in. And there are over 200 of these illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And the 600,000 Israeli settlers who've moved into these areas since 1967, they get quite a good deal. They receive generous subsidies from the Israeli government to live on the land, and they live under Israeli military law. The settlers live under Israeli civilian law, and they're able to build wherever they choose. But for the Palestinians in the West Bank, things are very, very different. The Palestinian areas are almost always under Israeli military jurisdiction. So you have two separate legal systems in the West Bank. If you're an Israeli settler, you're living under Israeli civilian law. But if you're a Palestinian, you're living under Israeli military jurisdiction. And there are 1,650 military laws that govern every aspect of the lives of the Palestinian people in the West Bank. And for the Palestinians in the West Bank, the Israeli settlers are allowed to build wherever they choose and they receive generous subsidies for building houses. But for the Palestinians in the West Bank, things are very, very different. You're unable to build in most parts of the West Bank if you're a Palestinian without a permit from the Israeli government. But the Israeli authorities never provide the permits. So what happens very regularly is that the Israeli military will come along and demolish Palestinian houses. And in the last year, in 2012, 620 houses in the West Bank were destroyed by the Israeli military. When I was in the West Bank last, about 18 months ago, I visited a small town, a small village called Sebastia near Nablus, which is what's called in what's called Area C, which is the area under full Israeli military jurisdiction. And Israel had already cut the water pipes to the village and diverted the water to the nearby illegal settlement. So the people living in the village thought, okay, well, Israel has removed our water supply, so we will install water towers on top of our buildings. But the Israeli military came along and said, you don't have permits for these water towers. So they ripped off the water towers and destroyed them as well. So this is the situation in the West Bank. We have two very different sets of situations, very different sets of living conditions depending on whether you're a settler or whether you're a Palestinian. Inside Israel itself, the situation is a bit more subtle, but it's equally severe. It's important when we talk about Palestine and Israel that we remember inside Israel, there are 1.2 million Palestinians living there as citizens of Israel. These are Palestinians who have so far been able to resist Israel's attempts to remove them from the land. Israel is one of the only countries where it's impossible to be a national of that country. No one in the world has Israeli nationality. You can have Israeli citizenship, so everybody who is a citizen of Israel is entitled to Israeli citizenship, but Israel has also created this idea called Jewish nationality. If you're an Israeli citizen, which includes the Palestinians, you're entitled to one set of rights, but if you're a Jewish national, you're entitled to a greater set of rights. And Israel uses this distinction, and there are over 30 laws that systematically discriminate against the Palestinian citizens of Israel. During, again, my last visit to Palestine, I visited two towns called Lid and Ramle. Have people in this room been to Palestine and flown in via Tel Aviv? Is there anyone here that, okay. So there's two towns near Tel Aviv, near the Ben Gurion airport, called Lid and Ramle, which are originally Palestinian towns. And we went and visited these two towns, and we went to Ramle. And there was somebody there who was clutching this, visiting with a friend who was visiting some of his family, and I was visiting with her. And we came across somebody who had some papers from the Israeli court. And he was looking really upset, he was looking really angry. And we went and spoke with him and asked what the papers were and why he was angry. And he explained that the Israeli government had issued him with papers that demanded that he demolish his own house. And if he didn't demolish his own house, the Israeli government would come and demolish it for him and then send him the bill. And this is not in the West Bank, this is not in Gaza, this is just sort of 20 kilometers out of Tel Aviv, inside Israel, inside the so-called only democracy in the Middle East. And the situation in Gaza, of course, is very severe when we talk about access to land and access to housing. Israel has imposed this medieval siege on Gaza. And again, this is not an accidental or a temporary policy. It's a very deliberate one to punish the Palestinian people. And there was a senior Israeli official giving an interview to the Israeli media, and he said the purpose of the policy in Gaza is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to kill them from hunger. And actually in some documents that were released last year, it was shown that Israel has created this calculation. What is the number of calories that a human needs to live that makes them permanently hungry, but they won't die of starvation? And Israel meticulously only allows an amount of food in to deliberately create food shortages, to deliberately create food insecurity. And this apartheid system also applies to Palestinians living outside Palestine. The majority of the Palestinian people live as refugees outside of Palestine. Any Jewish person anywhere in the world can go to Israel and become an Israeli citizen. And there are financial incentives to move to Israel if you're a Jewish person. Ironically, this is called the law of return. But for the 5.5 million Palestinian refugees living outside of Palestine, not only are they not able to return to their homes, they're not even able to return on a temporary basis. So when we're talking about the situation in Palestine, it's tempting to use the word occupation, but that doesn't really cover the scale of the situation. It doesn't directly refer to the situation of discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel, and it doesn't refer to the way in which Israel forbids and restricts Palestinian refugees from being able to return to their homes. So once we establish the idea of Israel as an apartheid state, and arguably the only apartheid state in the world, the question that we have to ask ourselves is what is to be done? And this is where we move towards the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. So the starting point for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign is the idea that Israel is only able to maintain its apartheid system over the Palestinian people because of the huge amounts of political support, financial support, and also military support it receives from Western governments, and also receives increasingly from multinational companies like G4S that operate as contractors who are contracted to run parts of the infrastructure of the apartheid system. I think there's something we need to be a bit careful of as militants for Palestine in Europe. It's very easy for us to sit here in Europe and say, well, the United States is the problem. Of course, there's a huge amount of financial support and military support, donations of weapons and so on from the US to Israel. But I think, as those of us in Europe, we have to also remember the absolutely crucial role that European support plays in the continuation of Israeli apartheid. And to give just one example of that, if we look at the arms exports from Europe to Israel between 2005 and 2009, we find that there were arms exports worth 7 billion euros during that period. So far from holding Israel accountable, most states, at least most states in the West, provide Israel with the political support and the protection on which its continued impunity depends. So given this complete failure of states to hold Israel to account, Palestinian civil society organizations issued this call for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. And this call for action was signed by 170 Palestinian organizations. It was signed by organizations not just based in the West Bank and Gaza, but also by organizations based inside Israel and organizations working with the Palestinian refugees as well. And if we just move on to the next slide. Yeah, so we can see that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions calls for boycott pressure on Israel until three things happen. Until Israel complies with international law by doing three things: by ending its occupation, by recognizing and ending its systematic discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel, and by respecting and implementing the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. These political demands show the importance of viewing the Palestinian people as one unit, and they show the continued existence of a consensus among Palestinians about at least the minimum that will have to happen in order for their right to self-determination to be implemented. More importantly, this set of political demands, it provides a manifesto towards which we can channel our international solidarity. So because these demands were so broadly put forward by the majority of Palestinian civil society, because they're based on international law, and because of the discourse of anti-apartheid and so on, the BDS campaign has won a huge amount of support in the 7 or 8 years since it was launched in 2005. And we've seen especially a huge growth in the BDS movement since Israel's attack on Gaza in 2008-2009. There are now active boycott Israel campaigns in more than 30 countries. Israeli Apartheid Week, which is a global series of BDS events, took place across 200 cities in 2012. And the support for boycott is not just broad in terms of geography, but it's also very broad in terms of the types of organizations that are supporting the campaign. So as well as grassroots solidarity organizations, we also started to see committed involvement in BDS campaigning from trade unions, NGOs, faith groups, and political parties, and so on. And partly because of this broad support, the idea of boycotting Israel has really started to enter the public consciousness. I was taking a taxi in Brussels today from a room where, office where I was having a meeting, to the train station to get the train to here, and I was talking to the taxi driver, and he's saying, "Oh, okay, why are you in Brussels?" He just picked me up from this office where there's lots of associations, so he was asking, you're from an association, and I was explaining, and I was saying to him, so you should make sure that you don't buy Israeli products when you go to the supermarket. And he turns around, looks at me in the back of the taxi and says, "But of course, I don't buy Israeli products, my family doesn't buy Israeli products." And I think we're seeing more and more, and I'm sure you guys have similar stories of the idea of boycotting Israel really starting to enter the public consciousness. And we're starting to see the impacts of that as well. So in 2012, the Israeli Manufacturers Association found that 20% of its members had faced cancellations of orders of products from European retailers, and that they believed that was because of the boycott. In fact, Israeli exporters are becoming so worried about the boycott of Israeli goods that they're starting to label their produce as coming from other countries. So now we're seeing Israeli produce being marked, ironically, being marked as made in South Africa. But BDS is about much more than just asking people not to buy Israeli goods. It's also about working within our own communities, working within our own towns and our own trade unions, in the associations that we're part of, to develop strategic campaigning that can persuade cultural figures and institutions and governments and companies to join the boycott as well. If we could have the next slide, Michelle. Great. So one of the most successful examples of strategic BDS campaigning has been the campaign against Veolia. Veolia is this huge French multinational company. I don't know if Veolia exists in Luxembourg or if people here have heard of it. So Veolia is a huge French multinational company that provides infrastructure services to local governments. It provides waste collection services and transport services and so on. In Palestine, Veolia is helping Israel to develop the infrastructure of apartheid. It's providing transport services to illegal Israeli settlements. It's collecting the waste from illegal Israeli settlements. So Veolia is helping Israel to colonize Palestinian land. So in response, what we've been doing in the boycott movement, in the BDS movement, is we've been building coalitions in our local towns in Europe that are capable of persuading our local municipalities not to use Veolia. These campaigns have a really sort of clear and simple message. We don't want our public money going to a company that violates Palestinian rights. So we've been going to local councils and telling them not to use Veolia, and we successfully persuaded more than 30 local governments across the UK, France, interestingly, recently in America as well, not to use Veolia to run public services in towns and cities in Europe. Veolia's, the first big success we had was in 2009, where Veolia was running the metro system in Stockholm. It had been running it for more than 10 years, and then information about Veolia's involvement in the settlement started to come out. So a big coalition of solidarity groups, of churches, of trade unions, went to the local council and said, look, we don't want our public money going to this company. We don't want to use a public transport service that's being run by a company that supports Israeli apartheid. And there was so much pressure on the local council that the local council ended up ending its contract with Veolia and using a different company instead. And we've replicated this success right across Europe. And we estimate that Veolia has now lost contracts worth more than 15 billion euros. And of course, Veolia is now starting to get worried because of this huge sum of money that it's lost. Veolia has been forced to admit the damage that the campaign is causing, and it's also starting to pull out of some of its involvement in the illegal Israeli settlements. And I think there's a good chance that if we maintain the pressure on Veolia, we can force it to pull out of Palestine completely. But I think this is a really interesting lesson, a really sort of interesting case study of how BDS campaigning has forced one of Europe's biggest companies to abandon projects in illegal Israeli settlements. And what we're doing is we're showing these big companies that there's a price to pay for being involved in Israeli apartheid, and I think that's really important. Perhaps, though, the most visible and the most sort of exciting type of boycott action that we're doing at the moment is the cultural boycott. If we could move on to the next one. Okay, leave it there for now. Yeah, just leave it there for now. Maybe they're in the wrong order. So yeah, the cultural boycott. So as Israel's standing in the world deteriorates, as more and more people become aware of what Israel is doing, Israel is increasingly using culture to whitewash its crimes. Following the Gaza massacre in 2009, an Israeli official announced that they were planning to send well-known novelists and writers overseas to show Israel's prettier face to the world. When Israeli artists come and perform overseas and they apply for help with funding from the Israeli government to do that, they have to sign a contract with the Israeli the Israeli government. This contract states that they promise to be a good ambassador for Israel and its policies. So when Israeli artists come and perform in Europe using public money, they're part of Israel's plan to whitewash its crimes. So we ask concert halls and venues not to allow Israeli artists that are taking state money to perform in Europe. And we've had numerous cancellations from big concert halls right the way across Europe, where they've not allowed these sorts of whitewashing exercises to take place. Similarly, when international artists go and perform in Israel, they help Israel whitewash its crimes. They create. If you go on the website of your favorite band and you see that they're touring all around the world and they're going to Israel, it creates the idea, it reinforces this idea that Israel's trying to create, that Israel is a normal, liberal European democracy. So part of what we're doing in the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement is asking artists and high-profile intellectuals not to participate in events inside Israel. And we've got a really sort of quite interesting and impressive list now of artists that have cancelled performances in Israel or have refused to perform in Israel, including Elvis Costello, Gil Scott-Heron, Vanessa Paradis, the Pixies, and this is Roger Waters from Pink Floyd, who's a really vocal supporter of the boycott of Israel. These cancellations, when these big artists refuse to perform in Israel, they create a really big splash inside Israel. They're reported by the Israeli media for days and days and days. I was speaking recently with an Israeli friend of mine. She's a militant. She's a member of Anarchists Against the Wall, which is a sort of radical Israeli organization. She's a member of Boycott from Within, which is this Israeli organization that's trying to support the boycott of Israel. And this Israeli friend of mine was telling me about her brother, who is not a militant for Palestine and can't wait to go and join the Israeli military and so on. But what she was telling me was that actually when his favorite band cancelled a performance in Israel, this was the first time where they had a serious conversation about the reality of Israeli apartheid. So what these cancellations do is they force ordinary Israelis to confront the reality of Israeli apartheid, to confront the international opposition to Israel's system. As well as forcing sort of institutions and companies to act, the BDS movement has also started to influence what European governments are saying, what European governments are doing. Until recently, the European Union was providing funding, grants and loans to Israeli companies operating in the illegal settlements. So we started all the way across Europe a huge grassroots campaign. Campaigns at universities, writing to members of the European Parliament, asking the European Union why it was providing funding to the illegal Israeli settlements. As a result of this huge grassroots pressure, the European Union decided to conduct an investigation into Israel's involvement in EU programs. And as a result of that investigation, the EU recently announced new rules where it will no longer provide this funding to illegal Israeli settlements. This might sound like a relatively small sort of policy shift, but it's really significant because we've moved the European Union. The BDS movement has moved the European Union through grassroots pressure. And now Israel and John Kerry are putting a huge amounts of pressure on the EU to reverse their decision. And I think what's really important about this is that European governments have now broken through their barrier of fear that had previously stopped them from taking this kind of action against Israel and from matching their sort of condemnations of Israel with some actions as well. So now we can start to demand even greater action from European governments. Could we move on to the next one, Michelle? The next one? There we go. Another big area of focus for boycott campaigning in Israel is Israeli fruit and vegetable exports. Palestinian farmers face the brunt of Israel's land confiscations. They face the brunt of Israel's demolitions and water theft and so on. And Palestinian farmers that still have access to land face sort of systematically implemented restrictions and violence, not being able to access their land, only being able to access their land at really strange times of the day, being forced from their land, and so on. And meanwhile, so Palestinian farmers are unable to grow their produce, unable to export their produce to international markets. But meanwhile, Israel's exports of fresh produce to Europe amounts to 1.5 billion euros every year. And the big Israeli export companies, the big Israeli farming companies like Mehadrin and Hadiklim are really taking part in the colonization of Palestinian land. So to give an example, Mehedrin, which is Israel's biggest export company, it markets the Jaffa brand of oranges. I don't know if you get them here in Luxembourg. So Mehedrin, the company that sells these oranges, its first orange groves were grown on the destroyed Palestinian village of Miska in the wake of the 1948 Nakba. So right from its very beginning, this company was helping Israel to remove Palestinians from their land and to remove the memory of Palestinians from having lived on the land as well. Today, Mehedrin owns and runs farms in illegal Israeli settlements. It works with the state water company to illegally steal Palestinian water and send it to Israeli farmers instead of allowing Palestinian farmers to access the water. Mehedrin is particularly active in the illegal settlements in the Jordan Valley area of the West Bank. The Jordan Valley is the area to the east of the West Bank along the Jordan River, and it makes up 30 to 40% of the area of the West Bank. And the Jordan Valley area is the sort of most fertile area of the West Bank. In 1967, the Palestinian population in the Jordan Valley was 500,000 people. Today, as a result of Israel's forced displacement policies, there are just 50,000 Palestinians living in the Jordan Valley area. And what Israel has done, as it's removed the Palestinians from the land, is it's allowed new settlements to be built on top of it. And it's allowed these companies like Mehedrin to grow fruits and vegetables in this newly sort of stolen land. As many as sort of 60% of these settlements in the Jordan Valley area are dependent on exports of agricultural produce. So we've had the removal of the Palestinians from the Jordan Valley. We've had the establishment of Israeli settlements in these areas. Fruits and vegetables are grown in this area, and then they're exported to Europe, to European supermarkets. So by buying these fruits and vegetables, we are funding and supporting Israel's colonization of Palestinian land. So in February, Palestinian organizations launched this call for action that we should start persuading supermarkets and governments not to have any business with these Israeli agriculture companies that are working in the illegal settlements. In the UK, the cooperative supermarket, which is the fourth biggest supermarket in the UK, has pledged now to stop trading with any of the Israeli companies that are operating in the illegal Israeli settlements. And across Europe, we're beginning to see supermarkets changing their policies about doing business with Israel, refusing to trade with settlement products or refusing to trade with particular companies. And I think it would be really good to discuss at some point how we can force more supermarkets in Luxembourg to stop trading with these companies. So I'm going to move on now to... Sorry, I'm just getting a bit distracted by everything that's going on with the slides. I'm going to move on now to the campaign against G4S. G4S is this huge British-Danish security company that provides security services to Israeli prisons where Palestinian political prisoners, including children as young as 12, are detained without trial and are subjected to torture. Virtually every Palestinian family has a family member that has been inside an Israeli jail. Like all of Israel's apartheid policies, Israel uses imprisonment for specific purposes, for two specific purposes. Firstly, Israel uses mass incarceration to deter Palestinian resistance. As I mentioned earlier, there are these 1,600 military laws in the West Bank, and all sorts of political activity are illegal. It's illegal to join a political party. It's illegal to join a demonstration. So Israel arrests and imprisons anyone who attempts to resist its apartheid regime. The second reason that imprisonment is used is to disrupt the development of Palestinian society itself. Mass incarceration causes huge emotional stress and is deliberately used to sort of disrupt the development of society. And we've also seen huge amounts of evidence, particularly in the last 5-10 years, of sort of constant, persistent use of torture and mistreatment of Palestinian political prisoners, including of child prisoners. Israel is assisted in its use of mass incarceration by this British-Danish company, G4S. G4S provides the cameras, the computers, the door systems, the fence systems. It provides all of the security services for Israel's prisons, and also for the interrogation centers where Israel conducts its interrogation, where it conducts its torture of Palestinians. So, and G4S, as well as having this huge role in the prison system, also provides services to the checkpoints and the apartheid wall and the settlements and so on. Palestinian prisoner organizations have called for action against G4S to hold it accountable for its role in the prison system. And there are now campaigns against G4S in more than 15 countries across Europe, across the Arab world and across Latin America as well. In South Africa, actually, they just launched their campaign against G4S in South Africa, and they launched it from Robben Island. And involved in the campaign against G4S in South Africa are various famous, prominent activists against South African apartheid as well. These campaigns against G4S have been backed by trade unions and human rights organizations and so on. And just as with the campaign against Veolia, our campaign against G4S, we've been forcing local governments and banks and so on to cut their ties with G4S. The year before last, the European Parliament decided to cancel its contract with G4S, following campaigning by us and by members of the European Parliament because of what it's doing in Palestine. Just last week, the University of Bergen in Norway again cancelled its contract with G4S because of its role in Israel's prison system. And G4S has shown itself to be really susceptible to this kind of public pressure. It's been forced to make statements and denials, and it's shown that it's scared. It's scared because it knows the BDS movement is able to cause it economic damage and is exposing its role. And I think if we keep the pressure up on G4S, then we'll be successful in forcing it to pull out of Palestine. These successes and the approach of the boycott movement, they perform sort of several really important functions. BDS allows us in Europe to focus on how we can take effective action, how we can end the support that Israeli apartheid receives from our own governments and from the institutions and from the companies that are operating in our communities. We're able to become more effective and achieve tangible results by having this local focus. BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, also performs a really important educational role. If erasing sort of Palestine's history, Palestinian history and narrative is a key part of Israel's strategy, then it's important then that we use BDS to tell that history and to tell that narrative. And the focus on local institutions and companies generates media attention, it generates public interest, and it generates an opportunity to communicate about Palestine to new audiences. So, for example, the G4S campaign allows us to tell the story of Palestinian political prisoners, and allows us to create an opportunity for the voices of Palestinian political prisoners to be heard in the media. There's been a huge amount in the UK, in Norway recently, of media coverage about the campaign against G4S. And that's also a huge amount of media coverage about the situation of Palestinian political prisoners. So BDS is playing this really important educational role. And also the growth and success of the boycott movement sends a really clear message to Israel, to Palestinians, to international civil society, that the world increasingly stands on the side of Palestine and is willing to take this kind of action to support Palestine. When figures like Stephen Hawking or a major rock band cancel a performance in Israel, or when a big European bank sells its shares in a company because of what it's doing in Israel, It creates a huge amount of media attention. It shines a light on the Palestinian struggle against apartheid. Al Jazeera English conducted a poll last year of 7,000 people from all the way across Europe. And they asked these 7,000 people a whole series of questions about their attitudes towards what's happening in the Middle East. One of the questions that they asked was, do you believe that Israel is a democracy? And of those 7,000 people, only 45% said that they believe that Israel is a democracy. And I think the grassroots solidarity movement and the boycott movement is playing a really important role in the way in which public attitudes about Israel are changing really quickly at the moment. It's also really interesting to look at the impacts that the BDS campaign is having on the Israeli elites. And if we could just go to this one. So this is from the recent Israeli election campaigns, where Zippy Livni paid for an advertisement on the back of a bus in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and the advert reads, "A vote for Netanyahu and Lieberman, you get international boycott. Vote for me, vote for Zippy Livni, and you get political agreement." So she made a political calculation that ordinary Israelis are getting scared of the impacts of the BDS movement. And just by appearing slightly less genocidal than Netanyahu, that she could pick up some votes that way. Top Israeli business leaders have recently set up their own initiative for peace. And they explicitly say, we want some kind of peace. We want some kind of settlement because of the boycott movement. When the EU recently announced these new guidelines about settlement funding that I talked about, 600 Israeli intellectuals and academics signed a letter calling on the EU not to bow to Israeli pressure to implement these guidelines. So you had 600 members of the Israeli elite, academics and so on, calling on the European Union to go ahead with a boycott of the settlements. So boycott is slowly opening up space for dissent within inside Israel. Of course, these sections of the Israeli elite, they're not talking about justice. They're not talking about the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. But it's interesting that boycott pressure is creating this kind of reaction. The leading Israeli think tank called the Reut Institute has spoken of BDS as a strategic threat, and they suggested to the Israeli government, and the Israeli government introduced a draconian law that forbids any citizen of Israel from calling for a boycott of Israel. So calling for a boycott is now illegal inside Israel. Netanyahu recently changed how the Israeli government is dealing with the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. Boycott used to be a responsibility of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he moved it to the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is this really important new ministry that he's set up. The Israeli embassy in London now has 2 full-time staff whose only job it is to work against the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. So there seems to be now a very real and a growing fear within Israel that it's becoming a pariah state in the way that South Africa once was. So just to conclude, I think what we're seeing now is really exciting. We're seeing cultural superstars, big financial institutions, major trade unions, faith groups, political parties, governments, and people all over the world starting to take boycott action. We're starting to isolate Israel. And I think now that we've established this framework, we're seeing the growth of the boycott movement. I think we need to have a conversation about how we can reach even more people with the idea of boycotting Israel, and how our campaigns can start to have even greater impacts. So I'll leave it there. I hope we can have a useful discussion. Thank you very much for listening.